our distinguished guest today is Professor Nadia Cheikh, who, as Peter said, will be presenting her latest monograph entitled Women, Islam and Abbasid Identity. Nadia Cheikh is Professor of History at the American University of Beirut, where she has recently been appointed as Interim Associate Provost. She received her BA in History and Archaeology from the American University of Beirut, and her PhD from Harvard University in 1992. She has also served as the director of the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies and as chair of the Department of History and Archaeology at AUB. Her initial research interest focused on the history of Arab and Byzantine relations, which led to the publication of her first monograph entitled Byzantium Viewed by the Arabs, which was published by Harvard Middle Eastern Monographs in 2004, and it has since been translated into Turkish and Greek. In recent years, her interest has shifted to various aspects of gender history in the Abbasid period. She has indeed been a pioneer in demonstrating that Abbasid discourses on women, gender, and sexuality are fundamental for understanding and writing early Islamic history. A common thread running through all her work is the significance of the other in constructing individual selves, but also communal and sectarian ones. In the past 15 years, she has published numerous articles in which she has revisited the Abbasid harem, the position of the Caliph al-Abbasid eunuch, the gendering of death, the depiction of the ideal spouse, to cite but a few. In 2013, she has co-authored a monograph entitled Crisis and Continuity in the Abbasid Court, Formal and Informal Politics in the Caliphate of Al-Muqtadir, published by Brill. And last but not least, in 2015, Harvard University Press published her latest monograph, which is the subject of tonight's seminar. So it is with great pleasure, Professor Cheikh, that I now leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Karen. I am honored to be presented by my student, Karen. Thank you for coming. The theoretical perspective of this book is rooted in a historical perspective which it is now more than 30 years old, namely that the writing of history is neither innocent nor transparent, that it's not possible to speak of an unmediated, unconstructed account of the past. This is further compounded in our case, in early Islamic history, by the fact that it was the generation of 800 people living in the year 800 who fashioned the texts that we still consult. These are the narrators, authors, and compilers of the Abbasid period. While not all conform to the Abbasid agenda, each of these texts has been shaped in response to it. At stake was the weaving of new links that looked to the past to give sense and legitimacy to a transformed present. The overarching structure of many historical chronicles and other types of texts seems to have been dictated by a master narrative whose purpose was to confirm Muslims as the only followers of the true faith and explain how Islam has attained its superior position over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries. So the major challenge in examining Islam's normative period from the rise of Islam until the fall of the Umayyad dynasty in 750 is that the available evidence dates from the late 8th century at the earliest, and is constituted of Abbasid narratives which were used to depict new conflicts as old ones. Dialogue in the Abbasid historical texts responded to episodes in ancient legend as well as to events that occurred in the 8th and 9th centuries. Thus, answers about one historical period or one historical phase is reached through studying another, and the historian's task becomes that of discovering similarities among the accounts and investigating their various ramifications through their correlations. It is indeed imperative to read such literary texts not as if they were windows to the past, but rather to realize that they require a methodological turn to the textual mechanisms of ideology construction and representation. This is precisely what I seek to achieve, what I hope I have achieved in this book, by adapting and employing methodologies that distinguish institutional, cultural, and discursive mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion, using techniques to interpret from silence and to write a history in confrontation with the extant sources rather than in conformity with them. How can one write history in the absence of contemporary sources? How can one write history through the insertion of women's stories? Through what categories and questions can they be articulated? Women and their perceived roles and character are used in this book as a major organizing principle to articulate cultural differences, draw socio-religious boundaries, and formulate identities. In other words, I investigate the ways in which the discourses on women, gender relations, and sexuality, and those of identities intersect and are informed and constructed by each other in the Abbasid texts. Historians have examined other periods and geographical entities in this way. Post-colonial historians have, for instance, analyzed the sexualization of cultural difference and the ways in which the gender constructs of the dominant imperial culture were used to explain the uncivilized nature of the colonized. Studies on nationalism have similarly stressed the uses of the categories women, gender, and sexuality in national self-definitions. Such analyses have demonstrated that depictions of women, gender relations, and sexuality are at the heart of the cultural construction of identity and collectivity. Historians of early Islam have yet to adopt a similar approach in scrutinizing Islamic texts. I'm hoping somehow to drive, fellow historians in a new direction, bringing in a methodology and an awareness to bear upon the early traditional Islamic texts. The narrative that the Muslims gradually constructed in their meta-narrative, and in a way, now I'm sort of coming more closely to describing the various chapters of the book and how they link, what is the link among them. The narrative that the Muslims gradually constructed in their meta-narrative was that the rise of Islam, that original moment of purity, brought about the elimination of the impurity and corruption of the pre-Islamic time of ignorance and jahiliyyah. The Islamic meta-narrative underscored the transformation of the Arabs from an abject, despised people that they had been, governed by passion and violence, into a society of monotheist militants whose defining imperative was to command right and forbid wrong, in obedience to the Quranic injunction, you are the best community ever brought to command, commanding right and forbidding wrong. كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. A text about the early Islamic conquests includes an anecdote in which, so we have this text in which you have a Muslim, a new convert, and the Byzantine. And the Byzantine is denigrating the Arabs, the pre-Muslim Arabs, to the Muslim. And the Muslim man, this is in the narrative, tells him, yes, indeed, during that time you are right, to denigrate us before Islam. During that time, it was as though we were on the brink of a pit of fire. على شفا حفرة من النار. It's a Quranic verse which is, inserted in the text. It was as though we were on the brink of a pit of fire, and whoever among us died in unbelief and fell into fire, and whoever among us lived in unbelief as an infidel. Then God sent among us a messenger. The confrontation with Jahiliyyah and with Jahiliyyah's many later incarnations was crucial for the mainstream Islamic cultural construction of itself as a religious imperial center. The accounts that focus on the original community of believers, on the Ummah, emphasize the ideological distance between this new community and the pre-Islamic order of Jahiliyyah. And so in the first chapter of this book, I discuss a dominant Jahiliyyah figure, Hind bint Utbah, wife of the Prophet's arch-rival from Quraysh, Abu Sufyan, and the mother of Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan, the founder of the Umayyad dynasty, and the arch-rival of the later Abbasids, and the texts of them are from the Abbasid period. Hind's excessive behavior, as it was portrayed in the Abbasid texts, constitutes, this is what my argument in the chapter is, that Hind's excessive behavior constitutes a prototype of Jahiliyyah behavior. It is an intentional construction and tracing it allows us to begin to understand the elaboration of the Jahiliyyah concept. Jahiliyyah was the focus of Islamic ideology from the onset, acquiring new layers of meaning but remaining a main foil against which Islam and Muslims still define themselves. And it was Hind bint Utbah, the transgressive woman whose savage excesses verged on cannibalism, who was its ultimate embodiment. Among the many Jahili acts, the one that stands out is connected to the Battle of Uhud. Earlier on, at the Battle of Badr against the Muslims, she had lost her father, her uncle, her brother, and her son. She took her revenge at Uhud, where in a transport of vengeance, Hind and the women with her mutilated the corpses of the fallen Muslims. They strung their cut-off ears and noses into anklets and necklaces. Hind finally ripped out Hamza's liver, biting on it. Hamza, by the way, is the uncle of the Prophet. Hind's near cannibalism functioned as an efficient marker in the discourse between civilization and barbarism, and also as a marker of cultural distance between the people who told the stories and those about whom they were told. The key categories were now Muslim, representing the cultural norms of humanity, and Jahili, representing deviations from those norms. Hind's behavior in Jahiliyyah signifies an immoral, inferior culture, and she is highlighted as one whose expression must be disassociated from Islamic behavior. This backwardness represents Islam's common, rejected past, and thus unifies the discursive Muslim community in the construction and definition of a new order. The transformation of the Arabs of Jahiliyyah from a barbarous, idolatrous, desperate, and abject people into the morally, ethically, and politically formidable people that they had become was a measure of the superiority of the Prophet Muḥammad and his revelation. A Muslim author writing in the 9th century described the transformation of Jahiliyyah Arabs to respectful Muslims in the following terms. They, the Arabs before Islam, they were the greatest communities with regard to unbelief. They worshipped idols and poured out blood, killing their own children. They were conquered by their own pleasures and their own desires. But Muhammad moved them away from the worship of idols and to the worship of the one God, and he made them judicious and wise, whereas before there had been ignorance. He tamed their hearts, and he ennobled their characters, those who before had been wicked. Islam had redeemed the Arabs from their Jahiliyyah, and while Muslim chroniclers present Islam as a decisive break in world history, supplanting what had previously existed, the Muslims of the time of Muhammad and the Muslims of all times constantly confront the temptation to slacken and turn away from the rigors of obedience to God. Hind eventually converts to Islam. And Hind is not only simply overcome by the display of Muslim power following the conquest of Mecca by Muhammad and his followers. She is altered and absorbed into Muslim subjectivity, thus signaling the interpenetrability of the religious categories that seem so overdetermined in narratives of the Islamic triumph over Jahiliyyah. Hind represents the Jahili past that had been mastered, as well as the Jahili past that had ceded place and been absorbed into the Muslim present. The traces of Jahiliyyah, nevertheless, necessitated constant reconquest and appropriation, thus continuously reminding the Muslims of the threat that Jahiliyyah would always present. And this is really a central unifying thread that runs throughout the book, and you will see as I go along. So the Muslims now were building a new world, fashioning a mode of living in the communal discipline that distinguished them from their pagan and Jewish neighbors. The Ummah's identity was to be partly defined by its adherence to specific social and ritual practices so as to affirm its distinctiveness from them, from the non-Muslims, from the Jews, Christians, and pagans. In accentuating the discontinuity between Jahiliyyah society and the Islamic community, the Ummah, gender roles were especially potent for carrying meaning. Women protagonists in the Islamic religious texts have consequently to be read within this context of social realignment that characterized the transformation from pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah to the Islamic Ummah. Islam, being orthopraxic, carefully delineated correct practice understood to be emblematic of belief. Muslims therefore erected boundaries between the acceptable and the reprehensible, halal and haram, and between an old and new order, mobilizing the concept of jahiliyyah to create distance from certain types of non-Islamic practices and behavior, notably death rituals. And this is the subject of the second chapter of the book, which is entitled Women's Lamentations and Death Rituals in Early Islam. With the rise of the new Islamic order, ritual mourning, notably the act of lamenting, niyaha, entered into crisis. The Muslims rejected ritual mourning because it was grounded in an ideology of death incompatible with the new faith's emphasis on salvation in the afterlife. The leading and almost exclusive role women played in keening, in lamenting, in niyaha specifically, made mourning an explicitly female ceremony. It is thus understandable why the campaign to reform mourning, and mourning practices in the new Islamic order would have a gender dimension. In hadith literature, the Prophet's traditions, utterances, and behavior of the Prophet, in hadith literature, this behavior was exemplified as one of the hallmarks of idolatrous behavior associated with jahiliyyah. Hence, women's roles in that rituals were pivotal in providing new normative guidelines, which were to be contrasted with the earlier pre-Islamic practices. But in this case, another dimension is added, namely the tenacity of women's behavior, because women will continue to lament. The tenacity of women's behavior, which will ensure the survival of jahili mourning behavior, particularly in niyaha, in guise of female lamentation. So niyaha, as an established institution of jahiliyyah, was considered to be a legacy of paganism. As such, it was condemned by the Prophet, who in a hadith said, "For jahili customs will be retained by my community. They are boasting of the family's achievement, ahsab, attacking genealogies, invoking the planets in order to receive rain, and lamenting the dead, and niyaha." So that these four things my community will always continue to do, no matter how much I tell them to desist from that. The fashioning of a new society that would deal with the drama of an individual's death in an Islamic way meant that, in contrast to pre-Islamic reactions, forbearance, sabr, was from now on the correct Islamic response. The Prophet is reported to have said that the deceased would be punished if a professional mourner, a na'iha, is hired to keen by the grave. Lamenting had to be contained because it inflames grief, and grief in turn arouses passion. Passionate lamenting was dangerous, all the more since it was inseparable from its status as a principally women's genre, and women are represented as emotional and irrational, always requiring male control. Women's role in lamentation, general lamentation and mourning, during Jahiliyyah is of course epitomized, as Peter mentioned, in the person of Al-Khansa, the most famous of all the lamenting poets, and the best-known female poet in the classical Arabic poetic tradition. Upon the death of her two brothers, her poetic potentialities burst forth in a never-ending strain of lament. Her hero, her obsession, was Sakhr, her brother. In her poetry, the work of grief and the articulation of grievance go together. The women who grieve at the same time as they protest and contest articulate their rage in uncompromising tones, making reconciliation impossible. The Islamic answer to excessive lamentation is reflected in Safiya's response to the mutilation of her brother Hamza at the Battle of Uhud. Safiya's patient reaction and words at the sight of the mutilated corpse of Hamza reflects a withdrawal from the female world of lament, shifting emotions away from the morbid relish of female grief, giving instead the death of the fallen martyrs its full meaning. In this case, it is a woman, a Muslim woman, who translates the new mood, the new ideology, which prohibits lamentation over the dead and promotes an ethic of patience when confronting the tests of time and the decrees of God. Women's lamentation will continue to represent, in the age of rapid religious change, a retarding effect of attitudes and rituals from the pre-Islamic past, which remain operative in the Islamic present. The textual examples that I use in this chapter give a pivotal role to the figure of the lamenting woman, underscoring the degree to which women play in shaping and acceptance or opposition of changing religious practice. Whether they were performing jahiliyyah or articulating the reformed Islamic sense, through lamenting or abstaining from lament, women were inherent markers of identity and belonging. The third chapter analyzes the mainstream textual output on the Qarāmiṭa, a Shiite sect that emerged in the 9th century. The Qarāmiṭa were viewed as heretical extremists and were accused of preaching and practicing communism of goods and women, that they shared everything, including their women folk. Such representations of heretics are a rhetorical construction and reveal how these reimagined dissenters were perceived, described, and categorized in order to define socio-political borders and secure in-group identities. The Qarāmiṭa dwelt within the geographic confines of early Muslim society, but outside its ideological framework, its models of comportment, and its institutional camp. Such ideological conflict between the majority and its minorities sparked perhaps the greatest fear in societies that are in the process of consolidation. Our sources on the Qarāmiṭa were written from the point of view of self-identified orthodoxy. Moreover, they were authored by men who used the heretical woman as a vehicle to release their own orthodox male selfhood. Such narratives reveal consequently little about the women in the groups in question, and a lot about how male mainstream writers used stories of women to drive and challenge conceptions of gender relations and sexuality, and more broadly, determine how women functioned as tropes in this discourse. And so in this chapter, in the third chapter, I analyze the way anti-heretical polemic was used in mainstream Sunni sources regarding the Qarāmiṭa. Any narrative is built on selection and exclusion. The main difficulty in understanding the Qarāmiṭa movement lies in the scarcity of sources bearing witness to their creed and their historical origins and development. This is further problematized by the fact that historians have to rely on the views of their opponents. The story of the Qarāmiṭa was that of those marginalized and even rejected by the meta-narrative in the process of creating the mainstream imagined community. This raises a series of questions. Whose story is told? From whose perspective? Who is being silenced in order to tell it? How does one write the histories of suppressed groups? The narrative that is our only source of knowledge is one that has imperialistically filtered the utterances of the marginalized Qarāmiṭa, a matter that compels us to think about the nature of historical representation in general. The underlying message of these accusations was that the Qarāmiṭa were people who had distanced themselves in a fundamental way from their general cultural context. Sunni texts suggest that the Qarāmiṭa promoted a sexual ethic which radically differed from the correct Muslim one, that they allowed community of women, as I said before, incest and sodomy. All the wild stories about the Qarāmiṭa were meant to characterize the movement as disorderly and rebellious, turning the Qarāmiṭa into a danger to society. This perception expresses the threatening image of a community with uncontrolled moral boundaries. And I will actually quote a few passages here. Judge Abdul-Jabbar, for example, states in Tathbit Dala'il al-Nubuwah from the 10th century that the Qarāmiṭa man who has achieved the 7th degree of initiation is to share his wife with others who have achieved similar degrees of initiation, since, and I'm quoting verbatim here, sharing wives is like sharing food, and the generous man is he whose wife has sexual intercourse with another man in his presence the way food is eaten in his presence. The 10th century Tarikh Akhbar al-Qarāmiṭa by Thabit ibn Sinan al-Sabiq includes the following anecdote. Ibrahim al-Sa'ir reports that he was at one time with Abu Sa'id al-Jannabi, Qarāmiṭa leader, when Yahya ibn al-Mahdi visited him. They ate, when Yahya visited Sa'id, they ate, and once they finished, Abu Sa'id left the room after ordering his wife to sit with Yahya and not to stop him if he wished to have sexual relations with her. The Sunni jurist from the 11th century from Yemen talks about al-Mashhad al-A'zam, on the ghastly scene, in which these heretics, after drinking, would gather their women folk, blow out the candles, and grab hold of whoever fell into their hands. And Abu Hamid al-Ghazali himself, affirming this suspicion, stated that what is known about the Batiniyya in general and of course the Qarāmiṭa and major Batiniyya, is that they allow complete licentiousness, including the lifting of the veil, the permission of forbidden sexual acts, and the disavowal of canonical laws, yani Sharia. Orgiastic behavior, incest, and sodomy were markers of cultural distance, of barbarity. However, unlike the barbarity of jahiliyyah or that of outsiders, the enemy within was much more dangerous because cultural distance was in this case not correlated with either temporal, as in the case of jahiliyyah, or geographical distance. These Sunnis, saw the Qarāmiṭa as related to perversion, especially since they were presumed neither to give up nor to assume a prohibition, a rule, or a law. Rather, the reigning orthodox body turned the Qarāmiṭa aside, corrupting them or taking advantage of them, the better to deny them. It is this ambiguity which deeply disturbs the identity, system, and order. And this is especially so when the subject finds the impossible within. Hence, what we have is a discourse about internal divisions, in which the lines between them and us were drawn between neighbors. Damning the Qarāmiṭa was important in the effort to neutralize them and to exert authority over them and the threat they posed, especially in times of disturbance when pressure rose to redefine relations among the various emerging communities. Women again were used instrumentally in this context to regulate the boundaries. Analyzing the images, ideas, and stories assembled in the mainstream narratives reveals the way in which the Qarāmiṭa as a phenomenon were imagined and interpreted by non-Qarāmiṭa Muslims. The world of the Qarāmiṭa was invented to resemble in some sense that of Jahiliyyah. It was a world in which distrust and fear ruled, in which the norm was a state of all against all warfare, and even worse, in which lasting bonds of family, community, peace, and prosperity would be unknown. It is a Jahili world reborn in the horrific excesses of the Qarāmiṭa phenomenon, whose violent character transgressed all limits. The threat that the Qarāmiṭa represented led them to be ejected beyond the scope of the possible, the tolerable, the thinkable, lying there quite close, but being impossible to assimilate. While the early Muslims assumed a reformist and punitive reproach to the pagan or unorthodox groups, they approached their main imperial rival Byzantium in a more nuanced manner, and this is the subject of the fourth chapter, Beyond Borders, Gender and the Byzantines. Gender and sexuality came to function as constitutive elements of Byzantine authority in two respects. First, through a developed notion of a sexualized Byzantium. Second, through depictions of the Byzantine male as effeminate. But describing the sexual difference of the Byzantines served also as a ploy in the construction of the Abbasid norm itself. Byzantium, the geographical elsewhere, will continue to play this dual role. Arab Muslim interest in Byzantine women did not stem from their importance or visibility. Rather, Arab interest arose from a desire to show difference and to strengthen the idea that Arab Islam was the foremost culture of morality, propriety, and control, in particular in the texts of authors who featured and contrasted the lax Byzantine attitude towards women and sexuality to the ordered perfection of Islamic civilization. Moreover, by insinuating that Byzantine men do not feel jealousy when their womenfolk engage with other men, the texts were striking at the very masculinity and by extension the moral order and authority of their rivals. Byzantium was posited as the locus of eroticism in a textual production constrained by a moralistic code. Exploited as a means of evoking values of erotic fantasy, Byzantium was, like the Oriental escapist sexual fantasy, a space of sexual promise and threat. To tell about Byzantine women and gender relations was to enter into a well-understood narrative, part of an ongoing dialogue with which the audience was familiar. Rather than taking the discussion to be evidence of corroborative information, this iteration occurs because the stereotype depiction agrees with the anticipated image. The imaginative approach of the authors helps explain how they could write with such confidence on the Byzantines when almost none of them had first-hand experience of the Byzantines and their empire. In the final analysis, looking towards Byzantium brought only counter examples of accepted, appropriate behavior, and that helped them to reaffirm their own identity. So these Arab Islamic texts, these Abbasid texts, disclose an acute anxiety in their representation of Byzantine women. This apprehension emanates from the cultural difference of the foreign Byzantine woman, as well as from the moral expectations of their own local women. Byzantium was figured in Arabic Islamic lore as libidinously eroticized, becoming pornotropics for the Muslim imagination onto which its forbidden sexual desires and fears were projected. Lack of control over passion characterized the Byzantines, who as such represented the anti-type and constituted a warning of what the future might hold if Muslim society were to relax its morals and controls. And so in the 5th chapter, it's about the morals and controls. The last 5th chapter, entitled Fashioning a New Identity, Women Exemplars and the Search for Meaning. And it focuses on the wives and female companions of the Prophet, projected as exemplary Muslim women, and their sexual uses in the process of defining the new Muslim identity. The Islamic writers, the Abbasid writers, uphold their most prominent female figures as powerful feminine prototypes who remain, until now, crucial for contemporary Muslim practice and politics. The formulation of a new order and a new identity was achieved through a demonstration of ethical opposites, of Islamic virtues that would allow the world to prosper, and the jahiliya or non-Islamic principles that would lead to its destruction. As the former prevailed through the power of its persuasion, Islam that is, the new order would define what it meant to be a true Muslim. An ideal type of Muslim womanhood was constructed to symbolize key aspects of the Islamic struggle for the maintenance of the boundaries of Muslim identity. The limits of these religio-ethical boundaries and the imperative for their protection were articulated in the sacred stories of the female exemplars who tested their limits and through their acts helped refashion a new accepted female Muslim identity. Early Muslim female identity was in fact dependent upon the limits set by the exemplar stories from the 7th century, the first Muslim century. The events surrounding Islamic origins would have lasting consequences on Muslim self-identity, that is. Muslim intellectuals articulated a meta-narrative of the primordial Islamic past centered on the events of the life of the Prophet Muḥammad and those of the period immediately following his death. Muslim theologians chose to remain anchored to this inspired past, and specifically to the men and women who most exemplified pious attitudes and model behavior. Legitimacy and authority came to depend upon perceived imitation of the example set by Muhammad and the first members of his community. That the foundational principle of inclusion in the Ummah was consequently a mimetic performance, through which Muslims sought to imitate the behavior of those men and women who were present at the founding of the religion and who observed for themselves and lived by the example of the Prophet. The primary female examples, of course, Quranic women, Mary, mother of Jesus, who did not, of course, was not a contemporary of the Prophet, but then the others, yes, the others, the wives of the Prophet, particularly Khadija and Aisha, and his daughter Fatima. However, there are dozens of other women who served as exemplars, defining by their behavior in both action and words the bounds of acceptable Muslim identity, but also the bounds of the ideal, Muslim behavior. So an ideal type of Muslim womanhood was constructed to symbolize key aspects of the Islamic struggle for the maintenance of the boundaries of Muslim identity. This was necessary given that human nature, as I said at the beginning, is always in danger of being overtaken by the primitive elements within it. In other words, reverting to jahiliya. This is why jahiliya needs to be constantly remembered. Jahiliya is recalled, for instance, by Fatima, daughter of the Prophet, in her one defining moment when she requested her inheritance from the first caliph Abu Bakr. On that singular occasion, Fatima addressed Abu Bakr in the mosque while he was surrounded by the Muhajirun and the Ansar, all companions of the Prophet in some ways, and reminded them all of their jahiliya condition from which they were saved by her father Muhammad. And in that speech, she quotes the Quranic verse which I mentioned earlier on, وَكُنْتُمْ عَلَى شَفَ حُفْرَةٍ مِنَ النَّارِ فَأَنْقَذَكُمْ مِنْهَا. You were upon the brink of a pit of fire, and he, my father, delivered you from it. Therefore, we may gather that it is up to Muslims themselves to live by this example and deliver themselves from such evil and incessantly discipline and transform any regressive elements. Women and the entire Muslim community hence must continually strive against any jahiliyyah or primal tendencies and combat any inclinations by emulating the companions of the Prophet, including the women examples. The ever-present danger of backsliding to jahiliyyah was offset by incredible success stories that served to promote and emphasize the strengths of the new order. If one had faith and lived a pious life, that counteracted the jahiliyyah in one's nature. For in spite of looming dangers, all is not hopeless, since Islam alters people. Even the relentless Al-Khansa, the poet, with her persistent elegizing of her fallen brothers, she was transformed. The sources state that she accompanied her 4 sons, she converted to Islam of course, and then she accompanied her 4 sons in the campaigns of the Muslim conquests, inciting them, reminding them of the glories that awaited them, and of the heavenly reward of those martyred in religiously motivated combat. Each of her sons advanced into the battle, uttering a few lines of poetry in response to the mother's speech, only to die one after the other. Al-Khansa's reaction to the news of their death reflected her conversion. She thanked God for their honorable end and asked that she be able to join them in his abiding mercy. And there is no poetry. Such narratives celebrated a massive transformation by which the pre-Islamic past jahiliyyah flowed into a triumphant Muslim present. The conversion of Hind bint Utbah in particular amounted to a declaration of total victory. Hind is the exemplar who was transformed by Islam. She is perhaps the only model of a woman who changed her position so completely. Authoritative narratives of the sacred women of the Islamic past helped Muslims to imagine their origins and to affirm their understanding of crucial moments of the past, which have helped guide their identity. Quran and Hadith female models are not only central to religious discourse of women. Mary, Khadija, Aisha, and Fatima became symbols of Islamic identity in dialectic with proximate communities, including the Jahili Arabs, the Byzantine Christians, and the sectarian Qarāmiṭa. The Quranic women, the Prophet's wives, and other female companions became models for emulation, their lives constituting powerful teaching devices for the faithful. They were and continue to be particularly important as models for Islamic formulations of self-identity, their meaning extending beyond Islam's origins into an eternal present. I'm finishing. Women's sexuality and gender relations are strongly affected by their presence in Abbasid narratives, which serve to determine moral and social boundaries and evolving roles and identities. Probing intention, context, and readings that attend to gaps and absences is essential for a critical reading of the Abbasid texts if one hopes to introduce a new understanding of these narratives. The Abbasids were struggling with the complexities of self-definition across their own internal linguistic, sociocultural, and religious models of identity. The sexualization of cultural difference and the ways in which the gender constructs of the dominant imperial culture were used to explain the uncivilized nature of other groups are the central threads that run through my book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cheikh, for this very rich and enlightening presentation. And we now open the floor to questions.
Yes. Sorry, I had a lot to cover.
To say.